So we are going to start with our last seminar of the year. And we are very happy because we are here with Professor Christof Pforr from Curtin University of Australia. We are going to make this is the last seminar of the year. And we are going to begin again, we think on March, on 2024. Well, okay. The seminar is going to be like always. Christof is going to present about 25-30 minutes. If you want to make a question, here you can talk, or if you are on the Zoom, you can talk, no sé cómo se dice, unmute and ask the question. And then we have some minutes after the presentation to discuss. So we are very happy. Thank you very much for being here. This is our.
Thank you.
Hello,
So, can I
more that looked
perfect.
no, no puedo, no puedo. Maybe when you can. Pues, look at it.
Okay, I can go. All right. First of all, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Natalia, and also for the opportunity to be able to present in this forum. So very much appreciated. And good morning to all of you. So it's a really great opportunity for me to share some of my research with you, and maybe we have some discussion afterwards. It's a little bit of an unusual topic, I guess. So it goes into the policy sphere, which is still very much under-researched in the tourism space. I will talk about the wicked problems. Before I start, let me see if that works. So we need to do a press to move this forward.
What?
Maybe I get to the next slide.
Yes. No? Don't find the no. It's
No.
okay.
So,
I think I pressed here
okay,
and
so I try this one.
maybe there this.
Okay. All right, so technology. Always good for surprises. All right, so basically a quick outline. So I will present my topic in two parts. The first one gives you a little bit of an introduction into the discussion about wicked problems. I go back into history, 50 years, And the second part is actually a case example, some research we have done in the context of Western Australia as well. So the case study is on the Airbnb phenomenon as a wicked problem. And so this is based, as I mentioned, on research we have done in our research cluster, where we focused on the impacts of Airbnb on Western Australia. But primarily it's based on a paper or chapter which will be published next year, which is co-authored myself, Christof Pforr, and Michael Folger, my colleagues. All right, so I will reflect on the concept of wicked problems, which was introduced 50 years ago, in 1973, by a famous publication by Riddle and Weber, Dilemmas in a General Theory of Planning. And I will come back to this in a moment, but first of all, I think when we hear wicked, I think we all agree that we somehow relate this to some difficult, complex issues or problems. And I think we probably would also all agree that today we are confronted with a range of challenges which we probably could label as wicked problems, so complex, interrelated, difficult challenges. So I would just want to refer to some examples, sustainability, digital transformation, demographic change. So I think this shows us that even after 50 years of discourse on wicked problems, it's still a very relevant concept today. So that's basically the reason why I tried to talk a little bit about it. So probably one of the most important challenge these days is climate change. We all agree that this is discussed in different fora, globally, nationally, locally. So it's a very, very important topic. And I think if we look at Australia, the images are from Australia. We are very, very much aware of the impact of a changing climate. So we have bushfire seasons, which tend to become more severe in intensity and also scale. We had, in the past 2 years, major flooding events in the East Coast or the eastern states. We have regular coral bleaching events, and we have throughout Australia drought occurring basically all the time. So I think it's a very, very important topic and probably one of the prime examples for a wicked problem. Some actually refer to climate change as a super wicked problem. Okay? So I think it's also important that we look at tourism as being part of this broader environment. Although we have a number of challenges, in particular, confronts the tourism system. I've highlighted a few tourism realities here. So we can actually observe a changing attitude of residents towards tourism and tourists. If you look at some of the over-tourism destinations or just the impacts of Airbnb in destination where we could actually see an exponential growth in recent years. But again, changing consumer behavior is also something we can observe in recent times. And this is often related to tourism mobility. So this is a core mobility enabler for tourism. So we really look here at the core of tourism and some of the challenges attached. And there are a range of protest movements around the world and in Europe in particular at the moment. And then also ongoing environmental changes, coastal erosion, drought effects. So often these are interconnected and linked to what I just mentioned before, climate change. So as we can see, it makes, in my view, a lot of sense to talk a little bit about those specific problems. So this brings me back to the wicked concept introduced by Riddle and Weber in 1973. So how did they define a wicked problem? So they looked at this as malignant, vicious, tricky, aggressive. Then they made a specific distinctions between tame problems, which they regarded as problems which can be solved rather straightforwardly through technology. And then they also differentiate from that wicked problems, complex, difficult to define, multi-causal, many interdependencies, leading to unforeseeable consequences. So they looked at those two different types of problem settings. And then based on that, they try to characterize problems by identifying 10 attributes. So they mentioned that wicked problems are difficult to define, they are unique. Sometimes there is a symptom of other problems, so the interconnectivity and no stopping rules and no boundaries. There are a range of different explanations possible. There's no clear solution. So the solution can only be good or bad. And we can't test the solution. And sometimes those solutions might actually lead to further irreversible effects. So quite a difficult setup, and the policymakers or the planners are right in the middle of that, and of course they have no right to be wrong. Okay. But the whole discussion needs to be put into the context of the social context of the 1960s in the US. So Riddle and Weber, they were able to observe an increasingly fragmented and plural society. And so there were the emergence of social movements, civil rights movement, the protest against the Vietnam War, also great awareness about environmental problems. And so based on this context and the observations, they came to the conclusion that these problems are different and they can't be solved by the traditional rational approach to policy decision-making, but that they require to incorporate stakeholder perspectives, not only to be able to frame the problems, but also to map out some potential solutions. So what happened then? So I think throughout the decades, the concept became or gained in popularity. And in particular, since the 1990s, the concept had entered the mainstream of policy discourse. There were also some extension to Riddle and Weber's conceptual framework. So most of the scholarly activity were based on trying to reduce the attributes, making a more concise definition of what wicked problems are. Interesting also, but maybe not a surprise, is that in particular, or the greatest uptake of the concept was in the area of environmental management and analysis, and also climate change. So just going back to with one example about the extension and further development, scholarly development of the initial concept. So Brian Head, I would like to refer here to Brian Head. He's probably the most active scholar at the moment in that space. He's from Australia. He works at Queensland. So he, a few years back, tried to highlight that wicked problems are characterized by high levels of complexity, uncertainty, and divergence. And they also tried to, a few years later, with the help of Alford, he tries to extend the original concept avoid not just having two specific problems, the tame and the wicked problem, but they try to really look at this as a continuum, where they used the matrix here, the low, moderate, and high complexity and uncertainty or divergence to define a degree of wickedness. So continuum basically from tame problems to very wicked problems. All right. So what about today? I mean, we talked about some of the current challenges, which require, probably would also agree, decisive policy action. But in contrast, what we often can observe is that there's a lack in political will to acknowledge and address these current challenges and to really put forward some decisive policy responses. This is not necessarily a new phenomenon. So this was already discussed as a non-decision making in the 1970s, or more recently, policy interaction. And in the context of tourism, Michael Rohl referred to this as chronic policy failure. So in tourism research, there are only very few attempts to try to better understand these wicked problems and how governments respond to these challenges. And a lot of the research which refers to the wicked problem, they just use the notion as a buzzword. So there's very little more detailed and specific analysis. Having said that, there are some activities in the context of tourism, looking at national parks, climate change, sustainable tourism, indigenous tourism. So this are some positive signs and some positive initiatives, but there's still, in my view, a major gap, and that I think it's critical in the current context to better understand some of these problems. So to make a little bit of self-promotion, we actually try to fill this gap with a book project with some of my colleagues, which are listed up there, where we focus on, so it's an edited volume, where we focus on the wicked problems in the context of tourism. And so we look at quite a range of different wicked problems, from tourism mobility to employment issues. And so our objective is, or was, that we try to define wicked problems in the context of tourism, that we also empirically try to better understand the different types of problems, and also importantly, how government responded to some of those issues, and what we can learn from those experiences. So look out for that. The book will be published with Emerald in 2024, and we are quite pleased with the outcome. So to navigate to those many issues we discussed in the book, we also adopted a catalog of governance strategies, which is proposed by Brian Head, where he came up with 7 different strategies of how governments in the past actually have responded to wicked problems. And in most cases, it was a mix of a range of different strategies put in place. So problem avoidance, so it's, I think, straightforward. We all understand this. So this is when governments don't see any responsibility in taking action on a particular issue, or where they try to divert to some other important matters. It might be politically opportune not to discuss certain issues, keep issues out of the broader political discussion. But it might also be simply because they're not able to respond because they don't have adequate information to base their decision. Then the next one is more the traditional top-down command and control hierarchical governance arrangements. So we could see these type of approaches in the context of COVID, where government, with very little consultation, made decision in regards to travel restrictions, social distancing measures, and so on and so forth. A similar thing, if we look at the next one, the science-based approach, which is basically evidence-based policymaking. And I think a good example is probably also related to COVID, where some of the decision-making was based on or supported by scientific health advice. Micromanagement is an approach where government try to divide a big complex issue in smaller manageable units and try to address this in that way. And this often leads to incremental adjustments, so step-by-step amendments. And this then also leads over to a strategy which is often referred to as muddling through. Then collaborative dialogue is the understanding that, in particular, when we deal with complex problems where different people have different views, that it's good to base decision-making on stakeholder consultation and stakeholder input. And then the last one is probably some sort of a learning out of the previous ones. So we use this type of framework to somehow navigate through the many issues we just uncovered in our book. But I'm not talking about the book, but I will talk about one specific case. So Airbnb, the Airbnb phenomenon, and I use this as an example of a wicked problem. Initially, I think everyone welcomed Airbnb as or was a welcomed innovation. There were great hopes that this innovation will actually lead to new opportunities for tourism and hospitality. And also, I think governments often try to facilitate the growth and innovation and also entrepreneurial activities with a more hands-off approach. But as we all know, and as the images here indicate, there's also a dark underbelly associated with Airbnb. So we could fairly quickly see that there are some major issues attached to the development of Airbnb, in particular exponential growth in certain areas, which really has caused a lot of headache for a lot of communities. And we refer to this as socio-political dynamics of Airbnb, and I will use this to somehow better understand the wickedness of the problem. I mentioned to you before that this is based on collaborative work with my colleagues, and also is based on research we have done a few years back, where a major project where we looked at the impact of Airbnb on Western Australia. So I will refer to Western Australia occasionally. And so we looked not only at the growth pattern of demand and supply, but we also try to better understand the concerns and hopes of stakeholders. So we conducted interviews with stakeholders, but also analyzed public submission to a parliamentary inquiry in Western Australia. And also at the fourth component of that research, we looked at 9 international case studies, how government responded to the Airbnb phenomenon. All right, so to understand, so basically it shows a socio-economic dislocation in some destination. And so to better understand this tension between the market and society, we adopted the double movement theory by Paul Polanyi. So this was published in his book, The Great Transformation, about 80 years ago. But I think it's still a very useful framework. So what he actually did in his publication, he traces the evolution of the classical liberal capitalism from the genesis in England to its collapse in the wake of the Great Depression. And then he also made the observation that this was followed by socio-economic and political reforms, characterized by greater state intervention. And the extension of that is that because he couldn't know that these processes continue on. So an extension of that, an interpretation of that is that this can also be seen as a cyclical reoccurrence of the same problem, market failure, and then state intervention. So we thought this probably provides a good framework to better understand this tension within the context of Airbnb. So here you can see, visualize the two movements. So the first one, if we translate this into the Airbnb context, so we have innovation, we have governments with a hands-off approach. They want to facilitate this, support the growth, the opportunities which might come along with that, and the entrepreneurship, and this then, as we could see through the images, led to some negative impacts within communities. So just quickly, for those who are not so familiar with the sharing economy services, so 10, 15 years ago, we could see a lot of new services popping up in different areas. Today, I will only focus on Airbnb, which is, in a nutshell, a convenient way to list and to find and to book accommodation on this online platform. Okay, and looking back to the first movement of Polanyi's double movement theory, so we can actually see an exponential growth of the Airbnb platform, which continues. I just checked yesterday, 2022, we had, or Airbnb noted, 400 million overnights. So accelerated expansion, supported by, as I mentioned before, by a more laissez-faire attitude of governments. And we can see a similar pattern in the context of Western Australia, with a little bit of delay. And based on our study, we were able to identify some perceived benefits. Additional income for hosts is often mentioned, increased competition within the sector, global reach of the platform, as well as greater flexibility in supply. But as mentioned before, there are always two sides of coin. So we can actually also see some of those negative impacts and the concerns of stakeholders, referring to Western Australia. For instance, the social and economic issues, the housing availability, it's a big issue, but also increase in rents. But also on the other hand, in the business community, there was a lot of discussion about unfair competition with the traditional accommodation provision. So there are a range of disturbance issues, safety and monitoring issues, and so on and so forth, which actually led to a range of negative impacts felt within the communities. So in the next step, and this leads over to the second movement. So how did government respond to these challenges? So we actually observed cases from around the world to see how they did respond. And out of these seven, the catalogue of 7 strategies, these were the most prominent we were able to identify. So the first one is problem avoidance. Again, this was often a deliberate policy response because, as mentioned before, governments felt that it's better not to become involved and to let the market navigate inside. So in the early days of the operations, this was something we were able to observe in Amsterdam, London, Barcelona, and Paris. But also, I alluded to that when I talked about this in general terms, the inability to respond. Because, and one example here is Berlin, they did actually nothing the first 3 years because it didn't fit into the regulatory framework they had put in place. So they were working on specific legislation for Airbnb, and so this explains their inaction in the beginning of Airbnb's operation in Berlin. Then the top-down hierarchical approach, so based on very little consultation and also based on no adequate information in general. And so this was often referred to as trial and error, where governments felt that they needed to do something. And so without any knowledge about the phenomenon, they just banned short-term rentals or they had specific restrictions put in place. And this leads a little bit to the next, the evidence-based policy approach. So not in a positive way, but more in a negative way, because this was not actually picked up as we could see from the trial and error approach. So it would have been a great opportunity to really tackle the issue and to initiate some research so that you actually have a evidence base for your decision making. But in most cases, this did not happen. This was not widely adopted. Interesting also the collaborative dialogue. So in the second movement context, a lot of governments actually felt the pressure from within communities, political pressure. And so they needed to do something, and maybe also based on that they were unsure about the situation in their jurisdiction. They actually incorporated stakeholder perspectives to find out a little bit more about the specific views and concerns of stakeholders, and also to see what kind of different policy option would be politically supported. So in Australia, this was a common strategy through parliamentary inquiries, where you could submit, so public submissions, but you would also invite experts to provide some insights. Also, a second approach is the partnership approach, because at that time, Airbnb has become a very important political player. So it was very important to somehow negotiate a solution. And so increasingly government actually engaged with Airbnb and engaged in a co-creation approach to shape future policy initiatives. So this was something we could see in Amsterdam, Barcelona, and San Francisco. All right, so finally, this is probably bringing all the different responses together. It became pretty clear that the impacts are not spread across all destinations, so that some of the issues are very location specific, and therefore there's no one governance approach to tackle this particular problem. And also another learning is that governments over time actually have adopted some sort of a middle ground between not allowing Airbnb to operate and laissez-faire. And often this is reflected in specific caps on the number of rental premises or rental days, density restriction, type of accommodation, and so on and so forth. So I think overall we can actually see that governments try to move into some sort of middle ground, but all very much dependent on the specific impacts in their jurisdiction. All right, so this probably can be summarized through this diagram here, the movement 2, where through increased government intervention, Airbnb was somehow re-embedded in the political and economic system. So that's quite interesting. All right, so already here at the conclusion. So what can we learn by looking at these interconnected complex policy problems? I think in regards to the sharing economy and Airbnb, so we all know they won't disappear. So I think at the beginning, some probably thought, okay, this is just a very short term problem. So they will stay here. And also the problems associated with them will stay here. So the wickedness of the problem won't disappear either. So I think it's therefore very important that there's an understanding that destinations can carefully manage any possible implications through carefully adjusting the innovations and to try to really balance innovation and regulation. You know, or what Brian Head refers to, that the policy cure is not worse than the disease. Overall, from our experience, the wicked problem lens offered interesting analytical insights into the nature of wicked problems, but also in the way governments were able to respond to some of those issues. What are future challenges? I think we probably can all expect that in the future there will be an increase in complexity of problems and also associated possible solution. And I think it will be more and more important to incorporate stakeholder perspectives, but this again will also become more and more difficult to engage stakeholders. So I think these are probably the two biggest future challenges in dealing with wicked problems. So with this little excursion, I would like to thank you all, and yeah, if you have any questions.
Thank you, Christof, for your presentation. It was wonderful.
I will stop the share and
Okay.
so
¿Vos o acá? Bueno, bueno. Vamos a ver si ahí así. Eso. Ay, de acuerdo. Claro, hay que sacarla.
el mouse se te va para allá.
Y ahora yo que no me ven.
No quiero sentarte. Vale. Okay.
Sí, apagamos. Sí, está bien. ¿Sí? No, muchas gracias. Vale. Okay. So, if someone on the online presentation wants to make a question, we start with you.
Good night.
Nicolas?
Hello everyone. Thanks a lot, Christof, for a really great insight and presentation. I was wondering about what is the the analytical part of the vehicle problem. So what do you think about, what is the type of models, what is the type of modeling that we should be using in order to deal with this wicked problem? So, there are like different frameworks. There is all this complexity theory related to network analysis and things like that, or the type of modeling that we used to do in economics, or agent-based modeling, which is the simulations. So there is all these let me call it infrastructure of modeling around.
Yes.
So do you think that there is one type of framework that will fit better or will be better to deal with the wicked problems?
That's a very difficult question. I mean, if I would have a clue, I probably would repeat that avenue. I think for us looking at this specific context for the first time, I think it was very helpful to use this to structure our thinking. And I think this was all triggered basically by these paradox that we have major challenges, but on the other hand, we are not able to, or we can't really see any policy action or decisive policy action. So I think from our initial insight, I think for us it was a useful tool to look at these complex problems in combination. In particular, I think even more helpful was the catalog of governance strategies suggested by Brian Head, 7 strategies. But in how far we could use those elements to develop a specific model, I would not be aware of a useful path in this regard.
Thanks.
Thank you, Nicolas. Is there someone who wants to make another question there on the Zoom? Here? A ver, ¿alguien? Ana, dale.
Okay, thank you, Christof. For me, it was really interesting. I didn't know anything about wicked problems, so for me, it's a new field of research. I have 2 questions about what you said. The first one is if, from your experience, which of the wicked problems are caused by tourism, and which of them are increased by tourism, but not specifically of tourism? I don't know if I can express myself very well, but maybe I think that there are some problems that are of the pollution of the city or the urban mobilities of the city or transportation.
Yeah, I think I alluded to that just right at the beginning when I started, that we need to really look at tourism being part of a bigger context. So in that sense, tourism contributes to certain problems which already exist in our context. So I think from that, I would look at this from that particular perspective. I mean, if you look at tourism mobility, this is probably in regards to climate change, or maybe in general, the greatest challenge. So how do we deal with a situation where tourism basically means movement, but this movement actually contributes to further increase in a changing climate, CO2 emissions. So I think, but again, this needs to be embedded into the broader discussion about climate change and contributors to climate change. But again, and I think I mentioned it before, the issue of over-tourism, or specifically the context of Airbnb, these are probably tourism-induced problems. Can probably be dealt with in that context. But then again, sharing economy is much bigger than
Yes.
just the Airbnb.
Yes.
So it's a bigger context there as well.
Thank you. And the other one is related to what you consider about political will and strategy of government to work on wicked problems. If you find some relationship between wicked problems and the sustainable development goals, maybe if they are included on the agenda of countries.
Yeah, I mean, sustainability is probably an ongoing wicked issue for many, many years. I mean, this is one of my specific research areas. I looked at sustainable tourism policies, and I'm always stunned. So already in the 1990s, sustainability was a prime policy development driver. So today we probably have all governments have some sort of a strategy put in place, also for tourism, to somehow contribute to a more sustainable outcome. But I think I refer to this in a number of publications, this paradox between reality and rhetoric. I think that is very, very difficult to understand. So despite all the policy initiatives, we are not closer to becoming sustainable in regards to tourism. In our book, the first chapter is written by Richard Butler and Rachel Dodd, and they review 30 years of sustainable tourism policy. And their conclusion is similar in that sense that there's very little success we can show. Very big problems in regards to policy implementation. And they also indicated there's very little hope that this will change in the future. So, I mean, maybe through an analysis like wicked problem perspective, you probably get some better insights in why governments do things the way they do things, you know, why they make decisions or don't deal with issues.
Okay, thank you.
I thought it was very interesting too. I haven't heard about the proper cider, so it's new to me. I was wondering when you refer to stakeholders, if you are referring to companies or to communities and I don't know, people of the city.
So when I refer to stakeholder, I include business stakeholders as community stakeholders, so to arrange a full set of stakeholders, because the business community represented, for instance, by the established hotel sector, they were also quite concerned about Airbnb naturally. And they were concerned about the unfair competition which comes along with these unregulated situations. So I think in this case I include full range of stakeholders. I think even I mentioned it with the partnership approach, trying to working together with Airbnb. I think it's very important. It's a very important stakeholder. It's a powerful stakeholder you have to deal with.
Well, I was thinking about the power of these stakeholders and how do you manage stakeholders that are so different and so unequal in their power. Yes, I don't know how to say that.
Yes, certainly. I mean, that you have a big player like Airbnb being part of the policy-making circle. You know, they refer to this as co-creation of policy initiatives. So basically writing. I think the power factor is, as always, probably the greatest challenge in how do you deal with the power imbalance among stakeholders. So yeah, I think that's also one of those wicked problems. I mean, participation, stakeholder collaboration. I mean, this is all stuff. But somehow we are not, we all know that this is important. It becomes even more important, but somehow we're not able to really implement this. So participation at all levels, community participation or broader stakeholder consultation. So it's yeah, I think there's also a chapter in the book focusing on this phenomenon. You know, we're talking about the need to get stakeholders involved. But somehow we're not able or capable to implement that.
I have a question that is quite difficult to me to articulate. Here in Argentina, we have a problem about real estate investment because our media sectors, media classes have lost their capability to access to their own home. And since COVID, it is very difficult to rent also because we have to know. And it is it is related, connected with the offer of Airbnb houses, not so much here in La Plata, but a lot in Buenos Aires. There are a relationship between real estate investment that they are not like in the 70s, middle class investment, but now very big stakeholders and Airbnb and so that platform.
Certainly, there's a connection. I mean, when we did our study, so one of the concerns from government was also that some would use this as a business model, real estate business model, in the sense of that it's much more rewarding to rent out and build apartments for children, rental needs. So, but I think in our study we actually found out that this is not necessarily the case, at least in the Western Australian context. But I know in Barcelona, for instance, it's a different story. So I think that would be a worrying development if you would have investors who actually have, I don't know, 200 properties on the Airbnb platform. So I think this is then different level of complexity, and this would be a worrying development. So I think this is probably also why governments look at certain restrictions. But I think it's an ongoing problem. I mean, this is probably now a global issue, that the limited housing availability. And so currently there's an initiative in Australia that they would offer those landlords who actually rent out their properties to the Airbnb market, they would be offered $10,000 to reconsider and putting it on the long-term market to ease some of the housing issues. So there are clearly lots of different levels of interconnectivity of real estate and Airbnb developments.
Anyone else? Yeah, I have two comments. I really don't understand or don't finally understand which is the meaning of a weak problems. I read the characteristics and I try to think about the weak problems, but I think this has to be that perhaps in countries like ours or Latin American countries, every one of our problems is a weak problem. So no, I mean it, because it's different. I think it's different. So is there something related with that regarding the definitions of the weak problems? I think if we think about climate change, it's okay. I trust that it is a weak problem. But for example, we talked the other day about medical tourism and the health public policies, and you look Germany, I don't remember the countries that you look for medical tourism.
So there was Germany, Italy, Poland, and Australia.
So you come back here to Latin America, you look Argentina, Brazil, Peru, Bolivia, and I think there is a weak problem from now and ever. So the weak problem is recurrent, but I think that it is a difference with the foundations of the problem, or I don't know.
No, yeah, you're certainly right, and I think it's a myth that there are solutions to wicked problems. I think it's just you just try to better manage wicked problems. I mean, as I said, with the Airbnb issue, it won't disappear. And I think it's also location specific. I just forgot my thought. I forgot my thought. So yeah, I think it's hard to find any specific solutions to any of those problems. I think it's just a learning to try to better manage the issues. And the definitional context, I think this is it's I lost my thought. I had something I wanted to know.
It's a wicked problem.
Yes, that's a wicked problem for me. Yes.
And the other question is related with the Airbnb. Do you have data to make something to complement your paper with? Because you said there are different cases,
yes.
So location specific.
Yes.
So perhaps the problem here in Buenos Aires is of one kind, and there in Western Australia of the other kind.
Yes.
And perhaps if you can, I think I know it's difficult to collect data on Airbnb and from different countries. And I don't know what you can do, but perhaps you also said regulations, and Amsterdam or some cities can solve or are in the way to solve. But the other when it was the meeting of context that Anna told you, there was the presentó, no me sale. Bueno, it was. There is one speaker, but he told us that in Spain there were a lot of regulations for Airbnb, but they don't.
They're not police, not.
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, so the regulation.
This was part of that they said we need to work together with Airbnb to ensure that some of these measures are actually that they help implement. So these are the negotiations with a player like Airbnb, this kind of partnership arrangement. So but I think with the Airbnb, I don't know the situation here in Argentina. So what we actually had done at the very early stages, we had discussions after a meeting like we had here today, and we met industry people. We had a presentation on innovation, and then afterwards we had a cup of coffee and we talked about Airbnb. Have you heard about the Airbnb? So do you know anything about it? We all had some sort of an opinion, but nobody really knew, and there were not really any data available. So we actually then initiated a project, also supported by the DMO, to get some idea about the pattern of growth in demand and supply. So this is what we have done as a starting point. But you need to, of course, monitor this ongoing. But we started that. So we have done this from 2016 to up to COVID. And also, in addition to that, we looked at stakeholder responses. So we conducted some interviews with key stakeholders to see what kind of fear they have or where they see opportunities. And we also were able to analyze a full set of public submissions to a parliamentary inquiry in Western Australia. That gives you a little bit of an insight to better understand opportunities and also concerns, negative impacts in your particular jurisdiction.
Yes, yes, yes. of course.
And then in the final part of the study, we also looked at 9 international case studies to see what they do, and we developed some sort of policy toolbox, trying to figure out if we can come and make some recommendations of what policymakers can do in that situation. And this also was flowing into this piece of work.
Okay.
But I think, evidence-based decision-making very important in the context of Airbnb in particular, I think. So that would be the first thing we would need to do, because how should you make a decision on something you don't know about? So now I'm not sure about the situation. Is this a topic here in La Plata or in Buenos
Not in La
Aires?
Plata, more in Buenos Aires, and it's the same problem that people don't, as Josefina said, that there are a lot of problems for people for having his own house or to rent the house. And the problem is that if you regulate, probably people won't, don't.
No, the problem is that the regulation of the law for the rental law has 4 years, and it changed because they want to be more
Inclusive.
more friendly for the renter. And like now in Buenos Aires, in La Plata, there are no
Places to rent,
no
to
places
live.
to
Yes.
live. And the prices that they are charging are impossible. And the problem is that, for example, here in La Plata, we have a lot of young startups. And then people is returning to live with the parents. And that's very strange.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult, I guess, in particular in this economic situation at the
Yes.
moment here. But it probably is also that the government never really looked at this topic specifically and monitored this.
But we have a very specific problem that now, as Josefina said, the law says that you have to rent your department for 3 years and to fix the price. So we have a lot of inflation. You rent the house here and you are in the 3rd year paying the same.
No, not.
Now
And they issue once a year, and with a.
Sí, con el
With a difference that it's very strange, but when you are going to pay the fees, more or less, more of the inflation, because it's a very strange.
I mean, this is an additional wicked.
In addition, this was the point that I want to make. An additional problem.
Yes. So this is what Riddle and Weber refer to, that they're all interconnected, and so sometimes there are symptoms of other
Yes,
issues.
we have the same problem,
Yes.
but with another.
And at the same time, you see there are an explosion of real estate, and there are.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult. My personal view is that I mean, a sector like tourism hospitality, you need innovation.
Okay, see.
That's very, very important. But on the other hand, you need to also avoid negative implication associated with. So that's, in my view, the role of government to carefully try to get a balance. I mean, this is very difficult between allowing innovation to happen, and on the other hand, to regulate the situation. So, because easily you can kill off any innovation which is so important as a driver in the sector like tourism anyway.
So,
I have a question. I write it down because it's hard for me. You think that these policies that you have identified have accomplished to minimize or contain the problems in the city in the case of Airbnb, and which one has been better of these policies?
Yeah, I think again, what I mentioned, there's no one size fits all approach. So you can't say this is the approach which works best across. So you can actually see in different, so for instance, in Western Australia, so we had the parliamentary inquiry, and so the government was very much pro Airbnb because they saw opportunities for the sector, but they were also very about the industry from the established hotel sectors. So they somehow try to navigate, and they decided now as the only regulation that you need to register your business. That's about it. So, but this is the very low level of intervention. But then on the other hand, you will have situations in Amsterdam where entire areas are prohibited. You're not allowed to run any Airbnb business there.
Sorry.
Yeah. So, but again, so you have Airbnb. You have the problem of over-tourism in Amsterdam. You have the incredible low-cost carrier situation, which allows people to travel for $30 to anywhere in Europe. So, you know, these situations further increase the problems of some of those cities. So Airbnb is just one aspect of that mix of problems, but they had to decide not to. They did. Yeah, so in some areas you're not allowed to run Airbnb business at all, whereas at the beginning they were very laissez-faire, seeing this as an opportunity. So I think also there will be changes throughout, you know, you always need to observe and respond and adjust your intervention toolkits.
I think also that these policies will always be related to the government structure and know how to define it. If they are more like liberal or they are more involved and make regulation, as you say, here in Argentina, I think it's really divided this way of thinking, like the state has to regulate everything, and on the other hand, no, we are free to do whatever we want with our properties. So it will depend on how the government thinks.
Yeah, the political ideology comes into play, and also the history attached to that. I mean, you know, here in Argentina, this goes back decades. It's still visible here. I mean, in most cases, if you look at tourism policy, they are embedded in a neoliberal economic framework. So, I mean, this is increasingly being criticized as further contributing to some of the problems. So, of course, this plays a role as well. The tradition of a country and the ideology which is carried on over the years. So I think in most countries, I would say you probably will see since the 1980s a very much a neoliberal economic policy framework adopted with some slight differences.
Thanks. Well, thank you very much, Christof, for your presentation. Thank you, everyone there. And we are finished the seminar.